Hey gang, Professor Feeser here. I provide education solutions to large groups and organizations. If you're searching for a learning pathway for your team or enterprise, feel free to reach out. My contact info is at the end of the video. In today's lesson, we're going to talk about APIs, specifically APIs out on the web. If we want to define that even further, let's say RESTful APIs serviced by HTTP. Wow, what a mouthful. To start, let's answer the question of where the heck are we right now? Well, we're at pokeapi.co, and this, you'll see, is a site that gets 10 billion API calls a month. An API call doesn't mean visits. That doesn't mean people are coming to this website. It means they're making queries to their database. Okay, let's think about what we said before. RESTful. REST means effectively one message in, one message back, right? So we're going to complete the conversation in a question and an answer. Question comes from the client, answer comes from the server. API, application programming interface, means an ear and a mouth that lets you communicate with the machine. It's an ear and a mouth on a machine. The ear is listening for a very specific pattern, right? That's how you make it take an action. And the mouth, right, is going to speak back only if the ear hears something that it, can process and recognize, if it sees that pattern. Service by HTTP. I mean, my goodness, HTTP is the protocol of the web. Anytime your browser is effectively a HTTP sending machine. You want to go to a website, you send an HTTP GET, and you receive back with HTTP a protocol called HTML, which populates the page. Well, with a RESTful API serviced by HTTP, we're still going to send that HTTP message, but the endpoint typically isn't going to send back HTML. HTML is really not great for getting back a blob of data, which is typically what APIs are being used for. A better example would be JSON. And I have a video on my account. If you're not sure what JSON is, hit pause, go watch that, or when this finishes, go watch it. We're going to see an example of some coming up here. If you scroll down just a little bit, they say check out the docs, but we don't need to do that. We want to see some action, right? Right up top, they say, hey, this is slightly different than the website you're on. You're on pokeapi.co, and that sent you back some HTML. But if you send an HTTP message to https pokeapi.co/api/v2/Pokemon/ditto, for example, we hit submit, it says, yes, here's what you would get back. This is JSON. This is, let's say, super lightweight data exchange format. Doesn't really care who carries it around. Could be HTTP, could be some programming language. It's pretty straightforward to understand. It's effectively, if we look here, for a 5,000-foot view, let's say that a name is mapped to Limber, and URL is mapped to this URL right here, and is hidden is mapped to false, and slot is mapped to 1. All of that's within ability. These numbers here are parts of things called arrays. Arrays are data organized by position, where what we were just looking at, like latest mapped to this URL right here, is an example of a key value pair, a map. Squigglies make maps. Square brackets make arrays, which are position-driven. Maps are key value-driven. Like I said, if you want to know JSON better, go watch the video dedicated to JSON. If we look at the direct link results, we could open that, I suppose, in a new tab here. Let's just hop to it. There we go. Looks like that's what we'd get back. Now, if you say, well, that doesn't look like what we were just seeing. That's because what we were just seeing is pretty printed. If you pretty print JSON, it puts an indentation after effectively every syntax, piece of syntax. So after the square bracket, we indent. After the squiggly, we indent, right? If there's a comma at the end, we start the next line just at the same indentation level because we're showing that there's multiple values inside of this thing that carry the same weight effectively. So that is an example of the type of data that you get back. Let's actually go look at the Poke API manual just a little bit, the documentation, and I'll show you some other neat things that we can do with effectively APIs, or this specific API. Okay, so back on the main page, let's click on API v2. It's up there in the corner. This is the documentation for how to use the API. So APIs aren't that helpful if you don't know the types of data that you can retrieve for them or send to them. You can send data to APIs as well. As far as I know, not the Poke API. This is a read-only database. But let's see the documentation for the example we just looked at. That's in Pokemon. And then once again, the subcategory Pokemon. This is what lets you look up Pokemon by name. So the new example here, if you plugged in 35 or Claire Fairy, it would give you back this JSON right here. There's the raw JSON, which we just learned is pretty printed. But notice on the left, there's all sorts of other subcategories. So for example, Pokemon, let's do species. Here's the API for Pokemon species, ID or name. If you passed in 413, Wormadam is the species that comes back. There, it looks like there's more information about that specific ID and name down through here. But, change it to 412, you're going to get something completely different back. Now, in the front of all of these, doesn't matter what I click on, genders, abilities, you're going to see get, G-E-T. That's the flavor or the type of HTTP message we need to send to this API in order to get back some data. So if you're thinking, okay, why does this work? If we just looked at an example where we took our browser and just went here. Well, your browser actually sends gets. That's what it does. When you point your browser to a URL, it fires a get there. That's a read. I want to read the data at this endpoint. Most of the time, we get back a web page, HTML, which, again, your browser is great at putting HTML on the page. We're seeing it right now. But if you send it to, say, an API that returns JSON, right? As long as you send that get there, receive back the JSON just appears on your browser. And your browser has that cool built-in trick where you can, do the pretty print, right? But that's like plugins to your browser. That's like extra because they know you're going to encounter it and want to read it at some point. They have things other than the Pokemon here. If I click on items, they say, oh yeah, here's Master Ball would be, if you looked at item, it's a different category than we saw before. V2 item, V2 ability, V2 Pokemon. So, this is the root. That never changes. That's effectively the category. It's the subject. And then at some point, you pass in a dynamic value. Squigglies, typically. You don't include the squigglies. Replace them with something. You get that back. We already looked at this in a browser. What I think would make it really over the top is to look at it at the command line real quick. Let's see if we can interact with this from the CLI as the last example. Okay, so here I am down at the command line. This is an Ubuntu command line. It's Linux. If you're going, oh my gosh, how in the world would I get a Linux shell? I'm a Windows user. No big deal. If you're Mac, you just pop open a command line. But if you're Windows, go into the Windows store, and there is an app called Ubuntu, like Ubuntu 24.04. That's probably the best way to get started with Ubuntu, is just install it as an app. It's actually a VM that's managed by Windows, but I'll tell you what, I'll make a video about that coming up. For right now, let's do our curl command. Curl stands for C URL. It's a play on words. And what we could do is just plug in there, in this case, HTTPS pokeapi.co/API v2 Pokemon. We're going to replace our ID or name. How about Pikachu? We all know Pikachu. And whoa, there we go. Get back that raw JSON. Now, how useful is this? Not super useful, right? But what it should be building for you is an awareness or an understanding that, oh my gosh, I might have scripting, or I might, this JSON makes sense to computers. It's a machine-to-machine language at the end of the day. Not real great for humans, but hopefully, again, what you just saw is read through the documentation. In this case, this is an open API. We didn't have to authorize, but pretty straightforward. If you can get the right pattern to the ear, in this case, send an HTTP GET. That's what curl does to this ear, right? And the pattern in this case is simply a GET. There's no authorization that needs to go along with it. The mouth says back all of this. Pretty neat. Well, there you go, gang. That's an example of an open API, no authorization required. Poke API is a great one to play around with. There are lots of other fun APIs that are out there, and some that do require authorization but are still free. So if you learned something here, if you want to keep learning about cool stuff like RESTful APIs, service by HTTP, go ahead and hit like, hit subscribe. I don't want to miss you on the next episode of Code with Feeser.